All right, so
Well,
welcome back to the Young Idealist, to my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And I'm continuing my special summer series of going through books by authors that have just come out. And today I'm extremely happy and excited. Dr. Matthew McManus, who is an incoming assistant professor of political theory at Spelman College. He is also the author of The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, which we're going to be talking to today, and The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, among other books, which are fantastic. So, in this text that we're talking about today, Dr. McManus presents a comprehensive guide to the liberal socialist tradition, stretching from Mary Wollstonecraft to Thomas Paine, through John Stuart Mill to Irving Howe, John Rawls, Charles Mills, providing a comprehensive critical genealogy of liberal socialism from a sympathetic but critical standpoint. McManus traces its core to the revolutionary period, catalyzed major divisions in liberal political theory, to the French Revolution that saw the emergence of writers like Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine, who argued that liberal principles could only be inadequately instantiated in a society with high levels of material and social inequality. To John Stuart Mill, the first major thinker who declared himself a liberal and a socialist, and who made major contributions to both traditions through his efforts to synthesize and conciliate them. McManus argues for a liberal socialism as a political theory which could truly secure equality and liberty for all, an essential book on the tradition of liberal socialism for students, researchers, and scholars of political science and humanities. And I'm about almost finished the text, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I am
thanks, man.
extremely happy and to welcome Dr. Matthew McManus on the Young Idealist today. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's a real honor to be back. And I have to say, it's been a great seeing the channel grow and all the really amazing guests that you've been able to get on, right? It's really something.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And it's always great to have friend and colleague on here to discuss a work, which, let me just say, I've read, I would say, most of all your books, but this is the one book that I think you really come to your own voice. Now, I'm not that your other books you don't have a voice, but this seems to be like something that is McManusian, if I can say that.
Yeah, it doesn't really roll off the tongue, does it? Yeah, I mean, actually, I don't think you're wrong about that. Not for kind of self-flattering reasons, but a lot of people have told me for a long time that you always write about the political right, post-modernity, all these kind of shitty conservative figures that you don't seem very fond of. When are you actually going to say something about what you believe in? So after getting a lot of those emails and kind of snarky comments, and my wife strongly suggesting that it might be time to actually do that, I thought that this would be the book where I try to lay out my own view of things. So I'm glad you like it.
One of the things that I found extremely interesting was at the very beginning of the book. I have several notes on this, and it kind of made me want to ask this question to you. You state that of all your books, none of your books have aroused so much anger before it was even written. It added shock to a number of angry socialists and liberals and center-right commentators gagged at the kind of perceived oxymoron of liberal socialism. So, can you maybe begin to discuss what this aroused anger was that shocked both leftists and rightists?
Sure. Well, I can tell you that the day I announced the book, I got a lot of angry comments from basically all the kind of the tankies out there. The people who have Mao imagery and Stalinist imagery in their profiles, and I was surprised that I seem to have united them with a lot of the neoliberal types. The kinds of figures who will have Thomas Sowell quotes just filling up their page, who quote Hayek whenever they get a chance, and you don't often see these people agreeing about much, but apparently they all agreed that liberal socialism was a bad idea. But I was also really pleased that quite a few people were intrigued by the idea. And actually, before I had even written anything, I got some messages from people saying, I think that that's kind of what I am. I think I am a liberal socialist, but I don't even know exactly what that means. So maybe you can explain that. So that gave me a lot of encouragement to write the book because I thought, well, there's a little bit of controversy and a little bit of animus, but it also does seem to have tapped into something that people are interested in, which is always a positive sign. But going beyond just my personal experiences, I think that at least part of the reason for this ambivalence is the legacy of the Cold War, right? During the Cold War, many liberals, and for that matter, many conservatives, came to associate socialism with authoritarianism, collectivism, state power, that kind of thing, right? And inversely, liberalism or capitalism was associated with freedom, individualism, anti-statism, an open society, that kind of thing. And what I hope to show in this book is that actually things are quite a bit more complicated than that, right? In the 19th century, many of the most esteemed liberals, and for that matter, many of the most esteemed liberal parties and movements, considered themselves to be aspiring, at the very least, to a kind of socialism. And going from Marx onwards, there are many socialists who learned an awful lot from liberalism. So I don't think that we should let the Cold War parameters of this discussion define it any longer. In fact, I would say that this is just another example, if we needed any more, of how the Cold War has really just resulted in an absolute decline in terms of people's overall intellectual standards, particularly when it comes to things like intellectual history.
Another question leading into your introduction that I found really interesting, and this is why I see this book as very pivotal, especially in political theory. You describe the trouble of deciding who belongs in a liberal socialist political theory canon.
Mhm.
And so maybe you can break down for the viewers how you came to terms with that canon, which you bring up Hobbes and Paine and of course Wollstonecraft and Mill and Marx. So how did the canon, come to the fore?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question, in no small part because an ambitious genealogist can go back as far as he or she wants, really, right? And when people have traced the origins of socialism all the way back to Plato, right? With this idea of a utopian Callipolis, where the ruling class, at least, will share all property in common and govern for the common good, right? Of course, there are qualifications to that characterization, right? But I thought that it was more important to talk about socialism and liberal socialism in a bit more of a modern context. Not because all the material of antiquity is uninteresting, but because I wanted this to be a pretty focused book, and I wanted the figures that I included in it to be pretty uncontroversially aligned with liberal socialism. So one of the default assumptions I made is that if people call themselves a liberal socialist or said what I want is a kind of liberalism and a kind of socialism, they should get included in the book. Because that's just all pretty straightforward, right? So people like Carlo Rosselli, John Stuart Mill, who I mentioned before, obviously Charles Mills, Chantal Mouffe, they were all easy includes into the text. John Maynard Keynes. Some were a little bit more controversial. People like Wollstonecraft and Paine, who obviously wrote before the idea of socialism was even in the air. But I thought it was important to show that there are antecedents to this tradition that, if not going way, way back, at least preceded the 19th century to demonstrate that there are deeper roots to these ideas even than the writings of Mill and others.
There is a necessity behind your logic. So I think the thinkers that you pick, which you go through in quite detail, um, is both thorough and I think grounded. You state again that the political theory of liberal socialism aims to go further than McPherson. This is where I think your book does a good job of what it's intending to do. You're suggesting that there should be a retrieval of egalitarian insights from the innovative liberal and socialist thinkers, but also a retrieval of the clear principles and methods and arguments. So I was wondering if you could maybe hash out what retrieval of principles and methods and arguments are you aiming in this book?
Sure. Well, the term retrieval isn't one that's coined by me. It's coined by the great Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson, who some of your listeners might know. Worked at U of T for most of his professional life, and certainly in Canada is widely considered to be a luminous and very important intellectual figure who's been somewhat forgotten about. Actually, the title of the book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, is a tribute to McPherson, since his most famous work is called The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, which is a critique of market or capitalist liberalism. So I thought, there we go. It's an homage, right? And what he refers to as retrieval is the act of going back into a tradition, in this case, liberalism, to retrieve or to recover the radical insights or radical potentials that might have been lost in its history. So McPherson is very famous for his critique of classical liberalism or pro-capitalist liberalism. What a lot of people forget is that he is also one of the first to actually say, look, there's important streams of liberal thought that were not relentlessly pro-capitalist. And certainly weren't all leading to neoliberalism. Millsian socialism is a good example of that. But he never really carried this project through to its fruition, right? As happens to us all, sadly, he passed away before it really got off the ground in a major way. So what I was doing in my own small way was trying to carry forward this very much McPhersonian project, which also, I should say, extends broader into the tradition of Canadian idealism. So it's not just McPherson either. And to add a little bit more meat onto the bones than maybe McPherson was able to do so in his life.
Well, I myself am happy that you're bringing up a great Canadian theorist, as well as the hashing out the Canadian idealism element there, since
Mhm.
I myself am an idealist. One of the things I found interesting was,
Actually, I was going to say, I'd say that you almost belong in that tradition as well, with your kind of reintroduction of a left Schellingian and very environmentally grounded kind of approach to German idealism.
so yes, I agree with you on that. So left Schellingianism, environmentalism. So I'm with you on this. You say when you're talking about like liberalism and socialism, you say some critics um, state that there are clear demonstrations why they're not mutually exclusive. Why do you think that there's so much resistance to this form of liberalism and socialism that you have kind of synthesized and conjoined?
Well, I think that there are two major reasons, right? One is, again, the legacy of the Cold War that I adjusted to earlier. So the other big influence on the book, along with Stephen McPherson, is Samuel Moyn, who some might know is a historian at Yale University, who's famous actually for his work on human rights. But he recently wrote a very good book called Liberalism Against Itself, which is about what he terms Cold War liberalism. And in this book, he very, very persuasively demonstrates how the kind of radical, egalitarian, even revolutionary edges of the liberal tradition were very much sanded off or ignored in the latter half of the 20th century, since many people decided that liberalism was anti-communist. Consequently, it must be anti-socialist, and consequently, it must just be the opposite of whatever socialism or communism stood for. And in Moyne's book, he talks about people like Karl Popper, of course, Hayek, Hannah Arendt, who's not quite a liberal, but he thinks was kind of a fellow traveler, and others, and says all of them established this canon of Cold War liberal thinking that banished Rousseau, Marx, Hegel, etc., from the liberal tradition, and insisted and said that liberalism is a cautious, mayorist, in many ways anti-egalitarian tradition, right? Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that Cold War liberalism or neoliberalism aren't species of liberalism, right? They belong in the family. But in my book, I point out that just like any normal family, sometimes you meet relatives that you think are kind of weird and that you very well actually don't particularly like. And for many liberal socialists, this is the kind of way that we feel about neoliberals like Hayek or Milton Friedman. Yeah, we might belong to the same family, but you often wonder, how the hell are we related, right? When we hold such different values and look so different. Second reason, I think, is frankly just that there has been a lack of attention paid, certainly in political theoretical circles and absolutely within the Anglosphere, to the tradition of socialist thought, right? And you don't have to take my word for it. Elizabeth Anderson, in a recent book, Hijacked, Anderson, for those who don't know, is one of the world's premier political philosophers, indeed, just philosophers wholesale. She points out, look, think about things like socialism, social democracy. These were enormously influential political traditions that shaped the world for many generations. But if you were to ask the average Anglo-political theorist, who are the major intellectual lights that guided the social democratic or the democratic socialist tradition, they'd say, well, Marx must be one of them, and then everyone else would be at a loss, right? So I think part of the problem is also pedagogical, right? We just don't teach the kind of figures who argued for a democratic approach to socialism. And rather like Anderson, I'm also hoping to make my own contribution to correcting for this pedagogical lack of attention.
Actually, you lead nicely to my next point, where you're talking, I think it's Alan Ryan who's talking about how consequently it's easier to speak about several liberalisms than liberalism.
Mhm.
And so at the same time, it's hard to define the liberal tradition because there's people that are against liberalism and there are people who are for liberalism. And there's also, it's hard to define socialism and, those that are critical of socialists and the both movement. And now you have two kind of conjoined together. Um, in 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 this text, when you're talking about liberal societies, you bring up two uncontroversial moral principles, which are equated to this liberal socialist movement. What are these two moral principles that you see so guiding this political theory?
Absolutely. So, at an abstract level, I say that all liberals are committed to the principles of equality for all and liberty for all. And this isn't an argument that's original to me. I take it pretty overtly from Ronald Dworkin, the great American constitutional theorist. Dworkin says that actually the commitment to equality is the more important principle for liberals, because you can't really have a deep commitment to liberty without a commitment to equality. Now, that might seem strange, right, given that the term liberal is so associated with commitment to liberty, right? As Maurice Cranston put it, a liberal is just a person who's committed to liberty. But what Dworkin points out is, look, you have to be committed to equality first and foremost because it's this belief that each individual life matters, and that everyone's life matters equally, that entitles you to a certain amount of control over your life. So when the king comes and says, I know better than you how you should live your life, or my well-being is more important than your well-being, you can say, fuck off, essentially, right? And that leads to this commitment to liberty, right? Once we recognize that it's as important that your life goes well as that my life goes well, as that a beggar on the street's life goes well, we can also insist that they have a special responsibility for their life that entitles them to make decisions for themselves without falling under the jurisdiction or the control of another person. And I add that many liberals, certainly outside the Anglosphere, would also acknowledge a third principle in addition to this commitment to liberty for all, equality for all. And that's, of course, commitment to fraternity or solidarity for all. Not one you hear spoken about as often in the Anglosphere, right? But certainly in the French Republican and continental liberal traditions, this idea of fraternité was extraordinarily important.
Why is there so much tension between maybe liberal egalitarianism and liberal socialism? Why is there this actual tension that's going on?
Sure. Well, I think that the part of the problem is that, to quote Marxism, a lot of people aren't really sure what liberals mean when we talk about equality, right? Some people seem to, especially on the political right, seem to assume that what liberals are insisting upon when they insist that all people are equal is that all people are physically or materially equal, right? That, ultimately I'm as gifted at sports or should be as gifted at sports as an Olympic athlete, right? Or that somebody who spends their entire day in a basement getting high is as intellectually gifted as somebody who spends their time writing the Principia Mathematica or whatever. But liberals have never insisted on this, right? Some proto-liberals and some liberals have gestured in that direction. A good example is Thomas Hobbes, right? Who said, look, yeah, some people are stronger than others. Yeah, some people are smarter than others, but nothing in a way, but in no sense is any of that scientifically interesting, right? Any human being could be easily crushed by even the weakest elephant. If you think Albert Einstein is massively smarter than a stoner in a basement, just think about all the things that Albert Einstein doesn't know. And really, he says the only reason why we imagine ourselves to be better than anyone else is because of how alike we are with everyone else. Since Hobbes points out that every human being is very prone to vainly assuming their superiority relative to everyone else, which actually makes us all like everyone else. But for the majority of liberals, what we're insisting upon when we talk about equality is, again, this, I think, quite deep idea that all life is sacred, right? Certainly all human life, and many would increasingly now include animal life. As well, right? And since life is sacred or possesses a kind of dignity, it's important that everyone's life goes well, or equally important that everyone's life goes well, right? And how liberal socialists interpret this commitment to equality, of course, is by saying that there's something profoundly wrong about having a society where economic inequalities lead to inequalities of power that give some people an enormous capacity to dominate most ordinary people in our society. That seems deeply incompatible with the basic principles that a liberal society is supposed to instantiate.
I have a kind of odd question at a weird time.
Sure.
I guess my question is, because I've seen you in promoting this book, you've discussed with multiple people about it, from Ben Burgess to Daniel Tutt. So
Love Daniel.
how do other um, how do other thinkers, maybe theorists in the more progressive left, view some of the ideas of your text? I'm thinking more of
Mhm.
maybe democratic socialists, or even people that are in favor of Lacerdo and Marx. And
It's a great question. Yeah. Well, I've actually been surprised, right? A lot of my Marxist and socialist friends have expressed skepticism of the book's thesis, but they've certainly been willing to hear me out, and we've had a vibrant discussion about my core claims, right? And what I think that I have accomplished, if anything, is at least showing or demonstrating that liberal socialism exists, is a cogent tradition within the broader socialist tent, and deserves to be taken seriously, right? Which is really all I want to achieve with this book, right? It was to just show liberal socialism is a thing. Now, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, that's an entirely different question. And a lot of my comrades have expressed skepticism that we should be aspiring towards something like liberal socialism. And that's, I think, really praiseworthy, right? One should be skeptical of any kind of political doctrine and put it to the test. And in a future book, I hope to write a text called Liberal Socialism, a Defense, that will make my kind of Rawlsian Marxist case for a specific kind of liberal socialism, right? But I will say, I also have experienced some hostility from a few leftists, especially online, right, who are just not even critical, just relentlessly acerbic about this. And to those people, I kind of say you just got to learn to deal with it, right? Again, I'm not making something up. A lot of people, including some very intelligent and prominent figures, identified as liberal socialists. It constitutes a unique canon of thought. If you want to reject it, by all means, feel free to do so, right? But I think that we're past the point where you can just say that that's oxymoronic. If that's the case, then take it up with John Stuart Mill, John Maynard Keynes, John Rawls, and all the other great philosophers who identified with liberal socialism.
I think that's where the strength of your book lies, this really nice genealogy that you have, and you've kind of collected together. One of the things that you nicely state about liberalism is that what liberalism doesn't answer is the question of imperialism,
Good.
especially when you bring up Frederick Douglass, being an African American and a slave, during July 4th. He says, what does this day mean to me, who's not free? And this is supposed to be, a country devoted to freedom, etc. So I think the strength of your text lies in its ability to kind of lay out this canon nicely, but also with a very nice rigor as well, too.
Thanks.
I was going to ask about the origins of liberal socialism, and if
Mhm.
we could maybe spend a little time talking about early liberalism, classical liberalism, and then left liberalism, if that's all right.
Sure.
So, in key terms here, so now we're going through the kind of meat of the text. Early liberalism starts, you say, with Hobbes. Why Hobbes? What is the character of this individual, who is the kind of who leads to the kind of proto-liberal theory, as you state in your book?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I want to point out one can draw the genealogy of liberalism back far further than I do, right? Critics of liberalism, like Nietzsche, have even located it in things like Platonism, right? This Platonic insistence that even the slave can come to rational knowledge through, if you want to call this, a priori recollection, right? Which has a kind of egalitarian and rationalizing quality to it. But I start with Hobbes because I think that Hobbes is the first major political philosopher to argue and defend persuasively certain core liberal principles. Now, in the book, I refer to him as a proto-liberal, since obviously the kind of political system that Hobbes defends isn't recognizably liberal in most respects, right? He calls for a kind of authoritarian system where people have relatively few rights. They do get a few, actually, like to defend themselves if the state threatens their life, right? But nothing that we would recognize as robustly liberal at this point. Nevertheless, right, he insists early in Leviathan, again, that all human beings in a state of nature are free and equal. He doesn't even really argue this from a moral standpoint. He sees it as just a scientific truth, right? All human beings are more or less homologous to one another. We're naked apes that are, for the most part, about as intelligent and as strong as any other one. And of course, Hobbes thinks that this is both an argument for a kind of social equality under the sovereign, but it's also a problem, right? Because it's precisely the equality that exists in the state of nature that allows us to so readily and so easily kill one another. Even if you're a little bit stronger than me, all I really need to do is wait for you to go to sleep, which you're going to need to do. Then I can stab you, take your pear trees, and then try to hold on to that for as long as I can. And then Hobbes also argues that in order to get out of this, what we need is to use our prudential reason to contract together to establish civil society, because we're more likely to be better off cooperating in this way than living are continuing to live in the state of nature, right? So a lot of these ideas, even if he doesn't necessarily cash them out in recognizably liberal form, are of course going to be picked up by later thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, etc., and pushed in more obviously progressive and even revolutionary directions.
What caught me off guard was in the chapter on classical liberalism when it
Mhm.
comes of age, where Locke seems to be the main character of this. State here, Locke recognizes a comparative instability of entitlements which are engendered in nature. So
Mhm.
maybe can you go into why Locke also features as this kind of classical liberalism? Do you see a positive element to Locke's argumentation or a negative element to it?
I absolutely see a positive element to his argumentation, right? So, one of the things that I point out in the book is that Locke is one of the first thorough liberals through and through, right? And this includes, I should add, even at an epistemic and metaphysical level, right? Because Locke's theory of the self is fundamentally predicated on this idea that who you are is based upon your experiences, or more accurately, your memories of your experiences. So he takes up a problem that philosophers have wrestled with going all the way back to Plato, indeed before. Who am I? And Plato obviously argued that the soul is what is essential to my selfhood in many respects, right? Because it's what endures when my body goes. But Halak offers a more interesting argument, I think, when he says, actually, what makes you you continuously is the fact that even though all the cells in your body have changed since when you were a baby, or when you were a child at least, you still remember being that child with your mother, right? And it's this memory of who you were back then that connects you to who you are now. And is constitutive of your real self. And this, of course, aligns very deeply with his epistemology, right? This idea that it's experiences or experience that molds cognition, right? And in this case, molds who you are. And I point out that this, of course, very much aligns with Locke's commitment to a kind of liberalism, right? Because it's a theory of selfhood that is deeply predicated on experience and self-making, right? Yourself doesn't kind of antecede the experiences you have in the world, like the soul might, right? It's very much shaped by what you do in the world. And this, of course, is aligned with Locke's arguments about the state of nature, right? Where we are in many ways a creative species. We come into the world with a natural right to bodily ownership. And then we gain property rights in other things through mixing our labor with the matter of the world, right? And as long as we leave as good or more for anyone else, we get to keep whatever it is that we make, right? Now, as many later philosophers have pointed out, this is an extremely problematic argument for property rights, certainly in a capitalist society. Macpherson himself points out that if you really took seriously this idea that mixing your labor with the matter of the world gives you property rights to it, you should have serious problems with capitalism, since the people who make the burgers, who make the lattes, who build the Tesla vehicles, don't actually get to keep or own those, right? Elon Musk own those, right? Nevertheless, right? It's a powerful and intuitive idea that very few people are willing to give up on completely, right? Uh, and what I point out in the book is that Locke's idea of both self-making and the creative making of the world is going to go on to have an enormous influence on many different strands of liberalism. This includes, of course, right-wing liberalism, with this insistence that you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get a job and stop asking for handouts, but also left-wing liberalism, since Locke is going to insist that the state has to respect your natural rights and represent your interests, and a failure to do so entitles you to rebel or revolt and establish a new kind of society. And of course, this is going to be absolutely central to the revolutionary left arguments going forward, all of which insisted is not only legitimate, but perhaps even a duty that people have to revolt and to replace tyrannical kinds of regimes.
One of the highlights of the book that I found striking is this defense of normative individualism, but also social ontology. So the individual still matters, so does the collective, but the individual is not reduced to the collective. There is a kind of social ontology where, as you say, community or solidarity matters. Do you find when you defend things like the individual in relation to the social, I don't want to say social ontology, let's say community, do you find the one element that the progressive left does not like or is more kind of leery or skeptical of in terms of liberal socialism?
I think that they are somewhat skeptical of it, although I don't know why, right? Well, actually, I do know why, right? I don't think it's justified. So I want to be very clear, right? My claim that liberal socialists are committed to normative individualism and methodological collectivism is unique to me, right? I actually cite Tony Smith, the great Marxist theorist book, Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism, where he actually credits liberal egalitarians like Rawls with exactly this kind of theoretical breakthrough, right? And then I kind of pick that up and say, actually, there are antecedent figures like Mill who also kind of intuited this idea of methodological collectivism and normative individualism, even if they didn't unpack all the implications. But what I'm arguing for, I think, is a pretty defensible position, right? Which is to hold that obviously it is the individuals and their well-being that matters from a kind of moral standpoint. It's a term I take from Derek Parfit book, Derek Parfit, right? And all liberal socialists are committed to this idea that it is actually existing individuals and potentially future individuals or future generations that is what is normatively important, right? Abstract entities like the nation or the Volk or the race, they do not matter from a normative standpoint, except to the extent that they matter to individuals, right? We might be derivatively concerned about the well-being of these kinds of imagined communities, but they don't gain a primacy in the liberal socialist normative vision. But while all liberal socialists, I claim, are normative individualists, they remain methodologically collectivists in the sense that they appreciate that individuals are embedded within a social ontology. And if you want to put it really simply, they agree with people like Marx and Aristotle that human beings are social animals, and it's only within a social setting that our individuality can be fully enabled to flourish. And I think that some leftists, as you mentioned, have a bit of a problem with this idea because they've, for such a long time, been critics of bad, possessive, neoliberal forms of individualism. And I think rightly so, right? But I think any leftist should agree with Marx that a individualism that respects and acknowledges that we are social beings is what we are aiming for. And just to give an example that I think grounds this quite effectively, Amartya Sen points out that for a lot of neoliberals or pro-capitalist liberals, you could say that human being was free. Indeed, they couldn't be more free than if they were left alone on a deserted island because there's no one there to coerce them to do anything that they don't want to do, right? You're on a deserted island all by yourself. There's no big state that's taxing you. There's no one who's sitting there interfering with your liberty. You're entirely unconstrained in terms of doing what it is that you want to do. While most of us would see being left alone on a deserted island as less a kind of freedom and more a kind of prison, right? Think about the movie Castaway or the TV show Lost, for example. And the reason is precisely for the explanation, precisely according to the explanations that liberal socialists give, right? We can only become truly free by exercising our capacities with others, and our individualism only expresses itself in a robust way through the interactions that we have with others. So I think that a good liberal socialist society is one where the free development of each becomes a condition for the free development of all.
Could we talk about these core principles of liberal socialism? And also, do you think there is one definition of liberal socialism?
Sure. I argue that liberal socialism is committed to political and economic democracy. And in particular, all liberal socialists respect the importance of things like liberal rights, but hold that these need to be extended to social spheres where they have traditionally not been extended, most notably the economy and the family. And I would think that this would be an uncontroversial claim, but it's actually quite controversial, right? Just to give an example, right? This is one I bring up whenever in an American context because it resonates with people. If you were to tell the average American, who in many ways is kind of inheritor of at least some classical liberal traditions, that the state was now going to tell you when you're going to go to the bathroom, what clothes you're going to wear, where you're going to go show up when, and it was going to demand all this to you without giving you a vote and denying you rights to express yourself, then there'd be a fucking revolution tomorrow, right? People would grab their guns and be waving those "Don't Tread on Me" flags, and they'd be marching right on Washington, right? And rightly so, right? But we allow these kinds of things to happen all the time, as long as they take place in the workplace, right? Your boss is allowed to tell you when you can go to the bathroom, what clothes you're going to wear, when you're going to show up, who you're going to associate with, and is absolutely entitled to deny you rights to express yourself, to assemble, to form a union, and you have no kind of democratic agency in those places, which is why, again, to invoke Anderson, she characterizes them as a kind of private government or private dictatorship that looks an awful lot like the kind of feudal dictatorships of yore, right? And Marx also made this point in Capital Volume 1, right, about midway through, where he points out that liberals talk a big game about the importance of militating against the aristocracy, the importance of freedom of expression, the importance of political participation. And Marx applauds them for doing so, right? But he says all of that falls silent when workers enter onto the factory floor, when all of a sudden we see serfdom and feudalism reintroduced, and the boss is the Lord, and people scrape and bow to them, and they have very little agency relative to the boss, right? So this idea of extending liberal rights and liberal principles into the economy and the family, I think is where the radicalism of liberal socialism lies.
How is John Stuart Mill the first liberal socialist?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, I share a lot of your reservations about utilitarianism, even Millsian utilitarianism, right? I point out in the book that what I'm doing is a retrieval, not necessarily a defense. So as much as I admire Mill, my own defense of liberal socialism would be a much more Rawlsian Marxist kind of defense of it than his, right? But I think that Mill deserves a lot of credit precisely for acknowledging many of the limitations of classical utilitarianism, particularly the way that classical utilitarianism had aligned itself so thoughtlessly with capitalist society, recognized its kind of vulgarity in this respect, and did his best to correct for it, right? So remember, Mill insists that his arguments need to be understood as utilitarianism in the very broadest sense, respecting humankind's status as a progressive being or as progressive beings, right? What he's just saying is, we need to be utilitarians in the sense of being concerned with human happiness, right? But that does not mean that we need to think of human beings in this very reductive way as little hedonists, each person just looking after their own utility maximization without much concern for everyone else, right? Mill was savvy enough to recognize that that's not how people really are, right? But in terms of his liberal socialism, this is something that wasn't really foregrounded for a very long time, right? If, like me, you studied Mill in your undergraduate degree, you'd probably hear about him as the great classical liberal, right? Author of On Liberty, a fierce defense of individualism against collectivism, and consequently about as anti-socialist as they come, right? Well, actually, in his autobiography, he talks about how he transitioned from being a pro-marketeer to being a socialist, and said that he quite proudly considered himself as falling under the general designation of socialists, right? And what he argues for in his mature work, right, uh, is a commitment to workplace democracy or economic democracy, as we sometimes call it now, where he says, look, by and large, capitalists are a pretty useless strain of being, right? They don't add very much to society. They're an enormously expensive indulgence, right? Having to pay for one Elon Musk when we could provide food and shelter for thousands of people is an indulgent society, I would argue, especially can't afford these days when we're facing environmental collapse. And he says, look, capitalists add a little bit of know-how to the workplace. We should credit them for that, but absolutely nothing that the workers couldn't do for themselves. And it comes at having capitalists in charge comes at a serious moral cost because what ends up happening again is in the workplace, we reintroduce a lot of those old feudal principles of subordination, this kind of bowing, scraping, brown-nosing attitude in the workplace that Mills just felt was beneath the dignity of a liberal society, right? Where he thought that people should treat each other as equals. There's almost a kind of kind of manly rhetoric there, right? Where he's like, a real liberal man doesn't want to be the better or the equal of anyone else. Or sorry, the better or the inferior of anyone else. He wants to be his equal. And Mill also presents moral arguments in addition to these more economic ones for liberal socialism. And in particular, he takes aim at a lot of the conceits of classical liberalism, particularly this idea that there's a kind of natural aristocracy that emerges through competitive market practices. So in his chapters on socialism, Mill says, look, I hear 1,000 times a day that hard work should be the basis of reward, that people shouldn't receive handouts, that you should have to work to earn your meal, right? And he says, and yet, our capitalist society has no problem with a capitalist working 40 hours a week and getting off rich, and a coal miner working 50, 60 hours a week from the age of 8 onward and living a life of endemic poverty, right? We also have no problem with people inheriting billions of dollars from their parents. Whereas other people, will try to put their best to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but they never quite make it, right? So Mill says if we actually took seriously this idea that hard work should be the basis of reward, then we would have a very different society than the one that capitalists admire and defend. But the reason, of course, we don't actually take the necessary steps to change things is because it's a lot easier to castigate the working poor by suggesting that somehow they remain poor because they're lazy and selfish, even while we turn a blind eye to the enormous indulgence, again, that is the existence of the very rich.
Maybe you could kind of hash out your Rawlsian Marxist position.
Sure.
I think this is I think this is something unique to you. Like I think when I think of you, I think of both Rawls and Marx. Um, and I've come to your defense certain times on social media about this issue too. So I was wondering if you could maybe lay out your Rawlsian Marxist position.
Sure. Well, this is where I'm going to sound kind of like a dweeby analytical philosopher. So I apologize in advance, right? But I've had to point out to some people that again, the book is a retrieval, not a defense, which might seem like a technical distinction, and it is, but it's an important one, right? So all the figures that I write about in the book argue for liberal socialism in their own unique ways, and I think they have insights that are worth acknowledging, right? But I don't think that any of them argue for it as successfully as perhaps they should. And I think that there are serious problems with the liberal socialist tradition, even as I've retrieved it, right? A very good example that you gestured to before is that many liberal socialists had very little to say about capitalism as a global systematic totality and its association with imperialism and colonialism, right? Or if they did have something to say about it, as in the Mill case, they often defended it as a kind of necessary process of historically uplifting underdeveloped so-called peoples for their own sake, of course, right? So I want to be very clear, right? It's not a hagiography, it's a retrieval, and I think that there are important things to retrieve there, but I don't know that anyone has gotten the formula right. My approach to liberal socialism, and there may very well be others, there might very well be others that are better than mine, right? Is to think that what we need is a combination of Rawlsian optimism of the will and Marxist pessimism of the intellect. All right. And what I mean by Rawlsian optimism of the will is I think that Rawls offers a very attractive normative argument for liberal socialism, right? At several different levels, right? This idea that the basic structure is the first subject of justice, that our primary duty is to the least well off, that a lot of the arguments for meritocracy or inequality are predicated on morally arbitrary kinds of suppositions, right, that just can't be sustained in the long run. All of that is very good, right? But Rawls's work is very seriously handicapped, as Sheldon Mullen points out, by its removal from the real world of politics. He engages in what's often called ideal theory, right? Kind of holding up a mirror to society and saying this is what you should try to approximate, but without really looking too much into the different material and ideological reasons why we don't actually move towards that kind of society, right? And this is where I think that Rawlsian normativity very badly needs to be complemented by the Marxist critique of political economy and the broader critical theoretical tradition of examining and condemning ideology, right? So in the new book that I hope to write, what I'm going to argue for is a kind of normative Rawlsian defense of liberal socialism, but pair that with a Marxist critique of political economy as it stands in the 21st century, and also arguing, following Marx, that we need to recognize that a lot of the cognitive barriers to the achievement of a more just society arise because of the ideological illusions that are thrown up by our existent material system. I think that this is a profound point that most Marxists have made that has been long underappreciated. It is in many ways a great contribution to epistemology, right? Since Marx points out that many of the reasons why we are unable to understand our social world, even though we create it, which Vico, for example, assumed, right? Since we create the social world, we should be able to understand it directly, unlike the natural world, which is occluded to us because it's created by God. Well, Marx says, ideally, we would understand the social world, right? But the problem is the necessary kinds of ideological illusions and fetishes that the social form and social relations perennially throw up that occlude us from understanding the world that we create. And his hope was that through critical theory, we would be able to apprehend the world more effectively. But ultimately, Marx said the only way to remove all the epistemic illusions thrown up by ideology isn't through cognition, but to change the world, right? If social relations are what throw up these epistemic ideological illusions, then social relations need to be changed in order to dissolve them. And I think this is where Marx offers a great contribution, not just to the socialist tradition, but to epistemology and social epistemology as a whole, by kind of pointing out that Socrates might very well have been wrong, right? The way to challenge doxa isn't just to challenge doxa philosophically. You need to change the social conditions that lead people to buy into doxa so consistently.
What a fantastic answer. And I just realized I have another question for you.
Sure.
You have written on Tillich and Christian
Mhm.
socialism. Does the kind of religiosity have a place in liberal socialism, or to a certain degree?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And I mean, what I try to point to in the book is the fact that there is an esteemed tradition of Christian liberal socialism that includes figures like R.H. Tawney and seminal theologians like Paul Tillich, right? Although I don't unpack this nearly as much as I should, right? But the way that Christian liberal socialists argue for their position is a way that should be familiar to anyone who's read the Gospels, right? Where they continuously point out that Jesus implored us to care for the wretched of the earth first and foremost, insisted that it was harder for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than it was for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven, unless the rich man performed the duties that he was supposed to, which was to redistribute all the wealth that he had acquired to the poor, right? Now, all liberal socialists, Christian liberal socialists, excuse me, are critical of many forms of organized religion, particularly forms of organized religion that become reactionary and align themselves with Mammon, right? The defense of money, affluence, and power, right? Just to give a good example, the great theologian Aubrey Hendricks, in his fantastic work, The Politics of Jesus, points out that there are very few things that can be called less Christian than the religious right today. Why? Because the religious right has set itself up to defend Christendom rather than Christianity, or Christendom at the expense of Christianity, to use the kind of Kierkegaardian terms, right? This kind of vulgar nationalism that is focused on hierarchy, ethno-chauvinism, and a defense of a society's ruling elites over and against the interests of the poor, right? And what Christian liberal socialists do is argue for, obviously, the need to economically reform this system, while also insisting that we need to be respectful of things like religious pluralism, people's freedom of assembly, basic liberal rights, and often giving this a religious twist, right? So, for instance, Charles Taylor says many reactionary Christians will insist that the state, for instance, should impose a kind of religious uniformity on the population. But again, drawing on Kierkegaard, what Taylor would say is if you impose religious views on people, especially those who don't have those religious views, what ends up happening, of course, is people come to hold inauthentic religious views, right? And there can be nothing that is more contrary to the real spirit of religion than imposing inauthentic faith upon people.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for, being with us today and taking our viewers through this wonderful text. Um, it's a fantastic book, and congratulations,
Thank you.
and I wish you success with the actual text. It's phenomenal.
Thanks, buddy. I really appreciate that. And congratulations on your new Schelling paper also, right? You got to be really proud.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah,
Excellent.
thank you.
Cool.